Okay, thank you for your patience. Now our second speaker safely arrived from the airport, and we thank him, the other speaker, the moderator, and everybody here for your attendance. I'm Tommaso Virgili, postdoctoral researcher at the Migration, Integration, Transnationalization Department of the WCB. And I welcome you all to the 6th event of our series on Islam and liberalism. Today with our speakers, Rashad Ali and Marwa Farid, we are going to discuss Islamism. Islamism is, in broad terms, could be described as an ideology that considers Islam an all-encompassing reality that should englobe every dimension of public and private life. And while Islamist final goal could be described as the Islamic State, the Sharia-based state, the means they use are adapted to the circumstances. And in this session, we will explore in particular the different tactics that contradistinguish their deeds and their plan in the Middle East versus Europe. So a reality where Muslims are a majority versus a reality where they are in a minority. So after the speaker's introduction, the short debate with the moderator, there will be time as usual for questions from the audience, both present here and following online. For remote viewers, I kindly invite you to write your questions in the chat. And I remind everyone that this event will be recorded and uploaded to our media channels. I'm now honored, and it's a pleasure to introduce the moderator of this event, Dr. Florence Bergeau-Blaclair. Florence is a senior researcher within the French National Center for Scientific Research, the CNRS. She's an holder of a doctorate in anthropology. She's part of the Society, Religions, Secularism group at Université Paris Sciences et Lettres, and she has specialized on the study of Islamic norms in a secular context, investigating what she calls the halal ecosystems, and recently authoring an excellent book on the Muslim Brotherhood entitled Le Frérisme et ses réseaux. I have to say that it's a sad sign of both the relevance and sensitivity of this topic that after the publication of this book, she has received death threats that have forced her into constant police protection. As a personal note, let me say that if an academic risks her life to pursue her legitimate investigations, something is going very wrong in our societies. But this should not lead us to give up, rather to double down our efforts in the pursuit of the truth. And I commend Florence for being brave enough to do so. As a final note, this series will continue after the summer break, and I invite you all to follow our website and newsletter for more information on dates and topics. Now, Florence, the floor is yours.
Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Tonight, I am, thank you for the organizer, thank you, Tommaso. Tonight, I am delighted to present and moderate a debate between two excellent speakers, very competent and very knowledgeable in their fields. This session, as you understood, will be about Islamism in the Middle East and in Europe. We will address three main questions. What is the spectrum of Islamist thought? What are the tactics Islamists adopt to spread their ideologies? How they differ in Middle East and secular Europe? So we will hear first, I think, Rashad Ali. Rashad Ali is a senior fellow at the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, specialized in counter-extremism. He studied at the Al-Azhar University in Cairo and at Markfield Institute in the UK. Is now hold a position in London. He was trained in Islamic theology, jurisprudence and modern studies in Islam, and he was formerly a national leadership member of the Islamist organization Hizb ut-Tahrir that he has left. Rashad currently works on de-radicalization initiatives with UK justice, police and community groups. And then we will hear Marwa Farid. Marwa Farid holds a position of country representative at the Danish Institute for Parties and Democracy. She holds a master's degree in security, terrorism and insurgency from the University of Leeds. As a researcher, she has focused on political Islam, jihadi terrorism, and transnational organized crime. Her work has covered Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, Morocco, Yemen, Zimbabwe, Lebanon, Jordan, the Netherlands, and Denmark. Marwa, I let you the floor for 20 minutes. Rashad, I let you the floor for 20 minutes. No? You want to swap? Okay. No problem. So, Marwa, I will invite you to take the floor for 20 minutes and not 1 minute more, if you can.
Thank you for being here.
Yes.
Sorry.
The voice? Can you hear me well? Yes. Okay. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. And in the beginning, I'd like to thank the organizers, Tommaso and Florence, for the opportunity to speak to you about a topic that I'm quite passionate about, and that's Islamism, especially in the Middle East and North Africa. So just a caveat, my presentation will cover Middle East and North Africa, and specifically the Arab Spring countries, and a little bit on the Gulf countries. Also, I'll cover only Sunni Islam because Shia Islam is very big, is a very big topic, and I don't think we will have time for it. As Tommaso mentioned, that Islamism is not a single movement or an ideology. It's a set of ideologies and a range of movements that wants to give an authoritative role to Islam in political life. And the goals of Islam, again, are almost common among all of the groups, regardless of how, on which part of the spectrum they are. But when we look at the different Islamist groups, we look at them, we see differences at 3 levels. The first level is who has the authority to interpret Islam. So the extent of traditionalism regarding the authority and knowledge. So for some Islamists, anyone can actually interpret Islam. And if we look at the ideologues of the Muslim Brotherhood like Qutb and al-Banna, they were actually self-didacts. But then we have the other end of the spectrum, we have the Salafis, and the Salafis, they hold a very traditionalist opinion of or view of who should have the authority to interpret Islam, and these must be the ones who are classically trained as imams or as preachers. Now, the second level of the differences between the different Islamists lies in the tactics and the strategies that they actually use to realize their goal. So again, it's a common goal, different tactics, different strategies. So we have some of them that what we call the political quietists that work in a very quiet manner within the communities underground to survive and expand. And then we have the other kind of Islamists that prefer to engage politically in the democratic processes. And don't get me wrong, I mean, it's always good to see Islamists wanting to be part of the political process, but it doesn't mean that they will become Democrats. And we've seen this in Egypt when the Muslim Brotherhood and the Salafis won in 2011 and 2012. And it was not a good year for the rest of the country. I mean, we don't have secular forces, political forces per se. They are non-Islamist political forces, more or less. And then we have the other end of the spectrum, Islamists that would use violence to attain their goals, and those are basically the Salafi jihadists. And then the third way to differ between the different groups of Islamists is the scope. And the scope of their goals and the relationship to the nation state. So the Muslim Brotherhood, for instance, is a transnational movement. They see the entire world as the same, the entire ummah, the community of believers, regardless of where they are. It's the ummah, and then it's under their purview. But then we have other Islamists who are only concerned with a specific national context, and they want to realize their goals within that specific national context, like Taliban, for instance. But for the MENA region and the Muslim majority countries, it's really important as well to look at two key dimensions of Islamism and Islamism teachings that have impacted our communities and our societies. And I say ours because I'm Egyptian. So until this very moment, throughout the past 4 decades, maybe 5 decades, the different Islamists in Middle East, North Africa have been disseminating the idea that religion is universal and religion is central to the life of the individuals. So it's not just a religion in the Western sense of the word, or in the Western sense of what religion should be, and it should be confined to the private life, but it's actually a way of life. And the emphasis of the Islamists on the centrality and universality of religion has actually helped them raise their profiles later on when the political environment opened up and there was opportunity for them, particularly those that we termed as the quiet Islamists, to participate in politics. Now, back to the tactics. Islamist rise in power in the Middle East, North Africa, has been attributed to the decades of the work that they have done through their charities, through the services that they have provided to the communities. And I think that's universal throughout Middle East, North Africa, because central governments have not been strong enough to provide all of these services, especially in underprivileged communities. Now, what I'm going to say now is a little bit controversial, but in the past, we didn't have this term coined yet, which is the uncivil society. So we have the civil society that we know, and then you've got the uncivil society that is also non-governmental organization, but instead of disseminating values of human rights, fundamental freedoms, providing services and equality, we have civil society, we have non-governmental organizations that are disseminating ideas that are contrary to what we know as human rights and fundamental freedoms, and to an extent try also to promote some of the Islamist ideologies together with the service that they have been providing. And again, they have been quite successful in doing so, and their success in the elections in 2011 and 2012 proves it. When we look at what they did in the elections, because I work in democracy support in different countries, and for me, elections is a fascinating process. There was a time when we looked at elections as the ultimate goal, but really it isn't. It's just a tool. But for the way the elections were utilized by the Islamists, defeated the purpose, because we've turned a democratic tool into a way or an avenue that would lead to what we now know as the electoral autocracy. So they are elected in government, but it doesn't really mean that they are democrats. But again, there are exceptions. So after the Arab Spring in Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, and Yemen, many observers, especially in the West, believed that more Islamists would rise to power as the region becoming more and more democratic, and that was true. I mean, if we look at how many of Islamist groups have won, not just the Muslim Brotherhood, but also the Salafis, in Egypt in particular, there was a massive number of Salafi MPs that won. But we're seeing a reversal of this trend starting 2013. So for a few years, the Islamists continued with the rise to power. But then if we look at Tunisia, for instance, in the last few years, the Tunisian president cracked down on Nahda and dissolved the parliament and effectively removed Al-Ghannouji, Rashid Al-Ghannouji, as a speaker, since there is no government. And also, by doing so, the Tunisian president sent the entire country into a political spiral. But then in Morocco, and that's an interesting example, in Morocco 2021 elections, the Muslim Brotherhood based or affiliated the Justice and Development Party, the JDP, was voted out of power. So they had 125 seats before. They lost 123 seats out of the 125. But also with this loss, there was always among those studying Islamism a conversation about the exceptionalism of the Moroccan example, because the JDP has already been in power for 10 years. So they have been leading the government for 10 years. And no one thought that they would be actually voted out of power. Now, Egyptian Islamists, and I think all of us know where they are at the moment. Some of them are in jail. Others are on the run. And some of them are actually living here and living in Turkey, Qatar, London, and other countries around Europe. And they are supported by a network of 7 organizations that are part of the Muslim Brotherhood organization worldwide. Now, we look at this down or the demise of the Islamist movement in the Middle East, but actually I would say that's just, I think it's a temporary trend. But also we need to see why this is happening and whether this decline will continue or are they going to rise again. Now, in Morocco, the defeat of the PJD was not due to the disillusionment with the ideology. It has nothing to do with the ideology, but it has to do with their performance as individuals who have been voted into the parliament. They could not improve the economy, and there were other issues, socioeconomic issues, that they could not address. So they were basically voted out based on their performance. In Tunisia, Nahda is actually kind of a success story until Kais Saied cracked down on them, because they were at least committed to the values of democracy, and they helped with the consolidation of democracy in Tunisia. So in that sense, Nahda was actually the exception to a lot of the other Muslim Brotherhood branches. But even though they were a good example, their popularity also declined. And again, it was not because of the disillusionment with the ideology, but rather with their performance when they were in power and their inability to alleviate poverty in Tunisia. Now, Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood in 2012 started losing popularity due to its inability to move from the mindset of the charity-based welfare system to being the government and having to do so for everyone without using the same tactics that they used when they were underground. This is something that they couldn't adapt to when they came in power. Now, the other big issue with the Freedom and Justice Party, and thus the Muslim Brotherhood Party in Egypt, was the fact that they, in the beginning, said that they are pro-civil state, and that what all the other revolutionaries in Egypt wanted. And that was the main reason why the Arab Spring in Egypt started. So they said, well, we are supporting the notion of a civil state, but they framed it as a democratic system based on a constitution that is inspired by the general rules and principles of Sharia. And of course, the Salafists and the jihadists, because again, after 2011, we had an influx of returning jihadists into the country, and also we had former jihadists who formed the political party. They were not very happy with what the Freedom and Justice Party said about the civil state, because in their platform afterwards, in the Muslim Brotherhood's platform, they were talking about the Islamic project. So we had this contradiction that made them lose a lot of allies on all sides. Now, in response to the rejection by the Salafis, the former president Morsi, in one of his very long speeches, described the civil state as democratic, constitutional, and a modern state that is based on equal citizenship, consultations, checks and balances, rule of law, and that the ruler is a civilian. Now, these are very familiar tenets of liberal democracy. And when we heard, because I was part of the masses at that time, when we heard that, we were like, okay, well, maybe they have changed. Maybe they are adapting now, and they are trying to get the non-Islamist on their side, and they are trying to use a compromise approach and a reconciliatory approach with the rest of us. But and in addition to this speech, actually, their platform that they ran on in the elections of 2011 and 2012, whether it's the presidential and the parliamentary elections, they actually also said a lot of things about that if they come to power, they will end the rule by the iron fist, and they will hold free and fair elections, and they will end the police brutality, and all of those nice things that they are very good in actually saying to the rest of us. But here is the problem. Despite the benign language and seemingly the compromise on the nature of the state, no agreement or alliance was actually achieved between the Islamists and the non-Islamists. The debate around the system of governance and the legislation was actually one of the most dominant features of that period of time during the constitutional drafting in 2012. Now, the FGP ended up writing a constitution that says a completely different, the complete opposite of what they were talking about when they said a civilian state, because they based the entire legal system on the principles of the Sharia law. And Egyptian laws, by the way, are not based on Sharia law. They are inspired. Some of them that are pertaining to the personal status law, divorce, marriage, and inheritance, while the rest are civil laws, and also to be in compliance with the international commitments that Egypt has signed. Okay, I'll finish, and then So just quickly on how the Arab leaders, or how the Middle East, North African regimes reacted to the rise of Islamists. There was a blend of approaches used to counter the rise of Islamists. One of them, I mean, I'm not suggesting that anyone should follow that, but there was a heavy-handed security approach to dismantle the structures of political Islam, especially the Muslim Brotherhood, in Egypt and in UAE and in other countries. But then they are left with the ideology itself. And the ideology of the Islamist ideology is so blended into the mainstream interpretation of Islam that it is really difficult to split them, and even more difficult to modernize it. So in Egypt, for example, President Sisi has called upon Al-Azhar to start modernizing the curricula and that is being taught to imams and so on and so forth. The other thing that Egypt did was looking at shutting down all the mosques that were not registered. So I'll give you an example. I'll give you an example of what is the situation now. We have 165,000 mosques in Egypt. These are official ones. We only have 69,000 imams that are approved by, by Al-Azhar. And the rest were volunteers from the Muslim Brotherhood and from the Salafis. And you can put two and two together and say what the result of that can be in terms of preaching the ideology of these groups. I'll stop here, and I can say more when there are questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I think it's a really interesting conversation. It's also a privilege to be in the room with both of you, actually, and the work that you do, and how important it is to be able to shine a spotlight on a conversation that I think is sadly very difficult to have. And it shouldn't be very difficult to have, because we should be, especially in the academy, be able to explore ideas. And if we can't explore ideas in the academy, then there's no space for us to entertain any kind of debate and discussion, no matter how we feel about those ideas. And I think this is one of the key challenges that actually brings to the front the nature of the debate we're having. Because the nature of the debate we're having is actually about whether we can discuss ideas or not, whether the very basic essence of liberty, of basic freedom to engage in debates and discussions, whether it's about religion, whether it's about politics, whether it's about other ideas, whether it's about ideologies itself, is what is at the conflict of this debate and discussion. And I know that can sound a little bit civilizational conflict. I know it can sound a little bit ideological, but actually I think that is at the center of these debates and discussions. I think very, very well elaborated and explained. When we're talking about Islamism, often people feel afraid of talking about religion, where actually what we're talking about is political ideology. That's a start point for me. That doesn't mean religion has nothing to do with it. Of course it has an essential part to do with it. But we are talking about people who define Islamism as a totalitarian ideology themselves. If you look at the early writings of people like Hassan al-Banna and speeches of people like Hassan al-Banna, who is the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood, you're talking about a period before the Second World War. As a result, you're not talking about people that are afraid of aligning Islam with communism, or even afraid of aligning Islam with fascism, because there wasn't this fear of fascism in the world, because we hadn't seen the damage that it could do in Italy, Germany, and across the world. We hadn't seen fully the damage that communism was bringing about in the world. And so totalitarian ideologies were the flavor of intellectual trends. It was cool to have a totalitarian ideology that dictated your economy, your social policy, the way you lived your life to the granular level. And so he wasn't afraid to say, Islam has the best parts, Hassan al-Banna in one statement, Islam has the best parts of fascism. Even the prayer manifests a leader, and we all follow that leader in congregational prayer. It has the best parts of communism, of equality, because everybody is equal in the prayer or the Hajj, etc. And it has the best parts of liberty, where the individual is responsible. So this type of language in comparing Islam to totalitarian ways of life, or even just alternative ideologies, was perfectly normal. So in the language of Islamists, it is perfectly normal to see Islam as a revolutionary and totalitarian ideology. In the language of the group that I belonged to as a teenager, Hizb ut-Tahrir, they would describe it as comprehensive, al-asas shamil, a fundamental and comprehensive ideology. If you read the lectures of Maududi, which are published and printed, at least in English, in the UK by the UK Islamic Mission, you can read how the Ummah, or the nation, is a revolutionary party. This is his description. The Muslims as a fraternity or a revolutionary movement. Jihad is that revolution to spread Islam across the entire globe. The rituals of prayer and fasting are training for the activist on how to become a revolutionary. This is the mindset that Maududi speaks of in one of his lectures called Let Us Be Muslims. In Urdu it's called Khutubat. So you have this kind of ideological view and lens by which we can start to view these things. The second aspect I think that's very difficult is trying to understand how we frame this. So look, if, there's this analogy that I like to give, and forgive me if it's laborious, as the village of the blind and the elephant that comes, and someone grabs the trunk of the elephant, and someone the ear, someone the body, someone the nose, and so on, and they all describe it differently, because none of them are wrong, but none of them are completely right, because they're describing a picture. So sociologists will look at Islamism as a social movement and see it in a certain light. Historians will see the impact of politics on Islamists. Theologians will talk about the religious dimension of Islamist ideology and how there's a very distinct impact of theology and scripture and interpretation. Intellectuals will discuss modernity, the alignment of modernity, the connection with modern ideologies and Islam, and how it resulted in the Islamist movement arising. None of them are wrong. They're all picking on different parts of what we're discussing. A civilizational movement, an ideological movement that has a strategy in the West, and that also has a strategy as a global movement that you've kind of outlined. In a Western context, that obviously is different because A, they're not necessarily seeking to take power and Islamize an entire state, because they're pragmatic. They recognize this is not the case. They look at this through different lenses. So jihadists look at this through a strategic warfare lens. What do they want to do? Some of them either want to bring the West in an us and them war and posit themselves on the side of the Muslims, and therefore the tactics of violence are presented through that light. Some of them want to engage in a warfare where they can see that they can have tactical aims. For example, blowing up a train in Madrid may well lead to Spain moving away from the coalition of the willing alongside the US and the West in Iraq. It tactically had that impact. It was for them a successful terrorist act. It may well be that strategists in the West that view things like Islamization or Muslim interest politics. So if we look at, for example, the Muslim Brotherhood movements in a Western context, they have various different front groups. The Muslim Association of Britain is the most popular one in the UK. There are alliances that they make. So you find leaderships of Jamaat-e-Islami, the Indian subcontinent version, branding, if you like, of the Muslim Brotherhood, who left the subcontinent, entered the UK, and who aligned themselves with leaders of the Muslim Brotherhood, and they formed something called the Muslim Council of Britain. They also took from there lots of mainstream Muslim organizations, religious factions and groups, but they lead on this because they're the most politically savvy. And they're a political movement, and therefore they're able to influence and impact the leadership of those organizations. They adapt, so what they essentially adopt is a Muslim interest politics, as opposed to the desire to establish an Islamic State in Britain, what they see is very specific Islamist interests and Muslim interests. Some of these things may well be very, very harmful to wider society. Some of them may not be. Some of them may be very harmful to Muslim communities, as an example. A good example of this is in the 90s and the noughties, you had the development of mainstream institutions aimed at dealing with problems that arise in Jewish communities and Muslim communities that may be fairly similar. So, for example, women can be tied into a scenario where they get a religious divorce and not a legal divorce, or they get a legal divorce and not a religious divorce. Either way, they may end up being tied to a scenario which they cannot help because of their beliefs, because of the community stresses and pressures, and because of the legal institutions around them. One way of resolving this that the UK government had was to say, no state will issue a decree nisi, a final divorce, unless a get has been granted, a religious divorce has been granted by the people, by the men essentially, in order to stop them controlling women through this mechanism. The Jewish community leadership accepted this and considered it a practical positive development. The Muslim Council of Britain rejected this, so legislation didn't pass which supported the rights of those women to be able to get a divorce through utilizing the state means to do so. This is just one example of where it works against Muslim women as a whole. There are obviously other areas of alignment which I think have become big parts of discussion. I'm hoping to just touch on these things and we can open up in questions and comments. The other parts of alignment historically, during, for example, the Iraq War, was the alignment of the hard left factions and the Muslim Brotherhood factions in the UK. So the Muslim Association of Britain and the hard left in the UK aligned to form something called the Stop the War Coalition. The Stop the War Coalition was a very, very popular coalition because the war was something that was very, very unpopular amongst the masses. Eventually, it was probably about 50-50, but it was a very contentious political issue. As a result, it had a lot of mass support. There were millions of people, or more, or maybe 1 million people, that marched against the war. It was led, however, by a broad coalition that was taken over by the hard left. When I say the hard left, I'm talking about Stalinists. People that were old Stalinists that belonged to, still to this day, Russian loyalists. Even though Russia is no longer a communist state, they're still loyal because they see this as a camp that's anti-Western. They were able to facilitate a relationship with the Muslim Brotherhood who saw their political interests aligned in this issue. And it causes tension to this day, because when these people are asked, how do you align with these people that are supporters of the Assad regime, who the Muslim Brotherhood affiliates in Syria actually have militant factions fighting against the Assad regime, this contradiction, this tension is something they see as well. These people are on our side in Iraq and they're on our side in Palestine, and therefore we support them, irrelevant of what's happening in Syria. It's a very interesting dynamic that comes out of this. We see those amongst the Islamists that I belong to with Hizb ut-Tahrir that were not part of the Muslim Brotherhood, but actually have the same conception, but they're more open ideologically. They want a global Islamic state, they want a global caliphate. They have an absolutist view of what that caliphate is. It's an autocratic state where the head of state adopts all the laws, adopts all legislation and determines all policy, appoints and selects governors and leaders, and so it has it's basically the vision that ISIS enacted. But that was their vision of what an Islamic state was. This is different to, say, groups like the Brotherhood and Jamaat-e-Islami. I mean, Maududi in one interview said he doesn't want a global caliphate, he wanted an Islamic state for Pakistan. But maybe if many Islamic states grew together in different countries, they could form a federation, and that federation could eventually become a caliphate. And this is in a Q&A, again, which is published in a book called First Principles of an Islamic State by the UK Islamic Mission. And you can probably download it online or you can order it from them. But that view, that pragmatic view, means that they are different to groups like Hizb ut-Tahrir who are separatists. They want nothing to do with elections, nothing to do with mainstream politics, nothing to do with local authorities, nothing to do with regular institutions. as opposed to the Brotherhood, who will formulate relationships in parliament. They will set up groups, parliamentary groups, APPGs, as an example, in the UK, where they will look at sharing interests and ideologies that are pushed forward by Muslim Brotherhood. Certain peculiar definitions of Islamophobia, which are ideological, will be pushed. Or, for example, having relationships with MPs that are friendly to their organizations, where they will host very, very radical groups in a parliamentary setting, because they've made those relationships with MPs in the UK. So these are the tactics they will utilize to spread particular interests. They're pragmatic, they'll form relationships, they'll form alliances, and they will do things such as ideological alliances. And the interesting thing here is you'll see the switch from the right to the left and the left to the right. So right now in the US, I'm sure we've all seen this, the polarization of LGBTQ-specific activism regarding questions around the trans identity are hugely polarizing debates on the right and the left. That's become a part of mainstream societal political debate. We've seen in the US an outreach from Salafists, from Islamists, to the far right and even to the mainstream right on these issues, where they see themselves as aligning on policy questions and legislation to do with self-ID, to do with LGBTQ rights, to do with pushing back against education regarding these issues. And they've aligned themselves and even written to the American Conservative magazine, as an example, and even made overt overtures to the right wing on these issues. CARE, which is essentially an organization which is very, very well known to be very friendly to the Muslim Brotherhood and Hamas, let's just say, in its former leaderships at least, not counting any changes in the current leadership, it has come out and made this very, very clear that their alignment on these issues is with the right, not with the left. So you'll see this switching on case-by-case issues. The last thing I was going to mention as well was you have these fringe groups which are more radical. And this is where you'll see groups which are overtly, for example, to give the Cage as an example in the UK, which is an organization which has previously hosted Anwar al-Awlaki, who was the Al-Qaeda Yemen leadership figure, who's been very, very open about his jihadist tendencies since 2001. He's spoken about the legitimacy of suicide bombing. In 2003, he gave a series of lectures about jihad, being the way forward, being militant jihad, and supporting opposition groups in Iraq as an... Sorry, I can't see that. 5. And so you've had these fringe groups, like Cage, which have supported their agendas, defining themselves as supporting prisoners of war, asirin. So they take the medieval concept that prisoners of war, everything you should do to free prisoners of war is a duty upon the Muslim leadership. They apply that today to terrorists. And they say terrorists should be freed. And they will posit, for example, we think the terrorism legislation is horrendous, it violates human rights, we think that there is a colonial perspective, it's asymmetric warfare. All of this is just positing language in order to appeal to people on the left and the center who are sympathetic to maybe some of the grievances in the issues with framing legislation, with the injustices of Guantanamo Bay, with maybe 90 days without charge is probably not a good legal measure. And so those types of things, which we may see as human rights violations, we will all maybe feel some sympathy towards. They will posit the language of grievances in order to justify their very specific ideological view, which, by the way, you can just look at their archive website and look at the question and answers with Anwar al-Awlaki, look at their description of their work, and it still shows what their actual ideological view is, as opposed to what they're presenting. So you have those fringe groups, which groups like Hizb ut-Tahrir will align with, and sometimes elements of the Muslim Brotherhood will align with, and sometimes, I know we're not speaking about the Iranian Khomeinist Islamists today, but you'll find groups like the Islamic Human Rights Council, the HRC, which is funded by the Iranian regime, which celebrated and mourned the passing of Soleimani, as an example, the war criminal that saw tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of Syrians killed in cities, starved to death, besieged. But they mourned his death in the UK. And they're paid by the Iranian regime, and they will align with these groups. And it brings these contradictions out. And this is my last, I will end with the points of tension. The points of tension are ideological ambiguity in the groups like the MB. Because of this ideological ambiguity, they're pragmatic, and they will be used, manipulated, and also use and manipulate others in their environment. The influence of Salafism, because Salafis are purists, they're not necessarily ideological, but ideological Salafism now is a mainstream factor. You have the breakdown which we're given, the loyalists or quietists, those that will do what Saudi say. Saudi says have a political party, Hizb ut-Tahrir will arise as a political party. Saudi say do nothing, they will do nothing. Saudi say support the jihad in Libya, they'll support the jihad in Libya. Saudi clerics say don't do this, they won't do it. So they're not quietists. They are loyalists, they will do whatever the Saudi regime says. If that means militant, if that means jihad, if that means quiet, if that means political, that is what they will do. You have this confluence of Salafi Islamists today, which is very, very widespread, and therefore the more radical element. And then you have the other influence, which you mentioned, I'm very pleased of, the secular society. Because of their ideological weaknesses, they will also become more influenced by this. And Nahda is a good example of this. Rashid Ghanouchi's time in London, seeing democratic processes and change, initially, if you read his writings, it was a strategic move to embrace democracy as a means to an end. However, the result of this has made him think about human rights and democracy and change his view on those issues, which is what has led to the tension in Tunis, which is why I think Qalb Tunis and other Tunisian Islamist groups have separated from them. And you rightly say their weaknesses, they failed the economy and they never changed anything. And the last point I was going to mention is actually what all of these shows is the last point of real contention, which is Islamism and modernity. The real tension at the heart of all of this is what I started with. It's with Islamism and modernity. The clash is where all of these things manifest in different ways. I'm going to stop there. Sorry if I went over time, but I hope it was at least start a conversation.
Thank you very much both. It was an excellent presentation, really. In your both presentations, you refer to the plurality of Islamist movements, both in the Muslim world and in Europe. And in a very short space of time, I'm sorry, you have given us a comprehensive picture as possible, emphasizing between the two sides of Mediterranean the continuities. And it was very interesting. Also, these movements originated in the Muslim world at the time of the revivalism over a century ago. They have diversified over time, but their project has remained the same. They are still active, aiming at Islamizing society. Islamist groups differ according to their inclination towards political quietism or loyalty, or the use of violence to attain their ultimate goal. The means of exerting pressure differ according to the context, with or without an Islamic tradition, with or without a secular regime, with or without democracy, with or without religious plurality, with or without mass immigration, and so on. So I'd like to ask you both a few questions. First, Marwa, you have addressed in your presentations the nature of Islamism, the apparent demise of political Islam. You show that very well. It's just apparent. The ideology remains even if there is a rejection of the political decision. The ideology remains. It is active, but also you underline that Europe or Western societies seems to be the target to convince. As you've said in Tunisia, Islamists rebranded as Muslim Democrats, and so are the Muslim Brotherhood in London. to try and avoid being labeled as Islamist in the West. I don't know if you talk about that actually, but if you can give some detail, could you also give some recommendation for Europe in the way it should cooperate or not with Muslim countries for addressing the problem of Islamism, and in what sense? And one more question on terminology. You talk about political Islamist, while not just Islamist. Does it exist an Islamism without politics? So,
wow, that's a lot of questions.
Okay. Do I give the question now, Rashad, or after?
Yeah, I think after.
Oh.
Okay, so the idea of rebranding. We've seen over the years the Muslim Brotherhoods, whenever they fall under repression, they rebrand themselves. And after the 2013, and especially also after the report that came out from the UK Parliament on the Muslim Brotherhood, and the membership of the Muslim Brotherhood is an indicator of potential extremism. Violent extremism. There was a session where Al-Ghannouji was there and other Egyptian members of the Muslim Brotherhood, and they basically said, well, we are not Islamists. We are Muslim Democrats. We believe in democracy and we are Muslims, so we're Muslim Democrats. The term Islamism now is associated with actually violence and terrorism and autocracy, and there's a lot of negative connotations to it in the Western world. So the rebranding actually does not target the Muslim countries, because it doesn't make any sense to them. I mean, they have already left the country, and they want the West. They want to use the same language that the West uses, and they want the West to help them go back to being in power if they could. So it's all about their political interest and the language that can actually get them the support that they needed from countries like the US and then Europe. Because when you hear democracy is in crisis, then you start thinking about how can we promote democracy? Mm-hmm. And I work in that business, but I mean, this is not how we make decisions on which country to support and which groups to support. But I would have to say that I'll give a very small example from the context where I work. In Myanmar, we have a coup, as maybe you know. And there are a lot of groups that decided to go on the opposition side, and all of them decided to brand themselves as the democratic movement. I had a big issue with this branding. I mean, all of us, of course, will support those who want to restore democracy in that country. But are they internally democratic? Not all of them are. Do they actually understand what democracy is? Not necessarily. I mean, we conducted a study on what is the definition of democracy in post-coup Myanmar, and interestingly enough, it actually has nothing to do with what we know as liberal democracy. So that's on your first question. The second question was, sorry.
So sorry.
The political Islam and not Islam, not Islamist. Well, it's easier to say political Islam and know that it will be associated with movements that do not particularly promote violence. Islamism, yes, it can work as well, but I think I like to make this distinction when I say political Islamists. It's like these movements that use different tactics to attain a political goal, not necessarily by using violence.
Yeah, there was another question. It was, could you give some recommendations for Europe in the way that it should cooperate with the...
Well, I think the first recommendation is... Of course, cooperation with Middle East and North Africa is essential. I mean, these groups are transnational, and what happens in the Middle East is reflected here, and vice versa. So cooperation and coordination is a must. But I also think that Europe needs to put some regulations in place when it comes to faith-based organizations, for instance, or schools that are established by faith groups. Mm-hmm. And you need to see whether Islamism is being mainstreamed quietly into your society as well. So these would be like the two key recommendations, I would say.
Okay, thank you very much. Now let's turn to Rashad. Rashad Ali, you are...
I actually have a few responses, is that okay?
Please.
Just because I think, all of those things are really important, what you said. And I think, just to take the last one first, I think we've made a lot of errors in the way we've dealt with these things in the past. So some of the mistakes have been, we've made errors on both sides of this, if that makes sense, where we've ended up supporting the worst regimes and repressing democratic movements and liberal movements and Islamist movements because we think they're on our side on this issue. Yep. Whereas actually the regimes we're supporting are just suppressing all opposition. And I think that's one of the mistakes we made. Mm-hmm. The other side of this is that we were very quick to switch from being great allies to Mubarak to great allies to Morsi to great allies to Sisi, which shows a lack of principle. And I think we need to step back and think, what is it that we hold as values that are going to be the strategic premise upon which we're going to project our value system, both internally in policy and foreign policy? And I think we failed in that regard. Broadly speaking, we failed in that regard. The other side of this is that we end up justifying the grievance narrative of Islamists. I mean, right now, as an example, we are rushing to send, not Germany actually, Germany's taken a very principled stance on Qais Said in calling out the Tunisian regime for being repressive, for clamping down on democracy, unlike Italy, unlike the EU, broadly speaking. So actually, that's been a good example of the German state's done that. But actually, the other countries have rushed forward when actually what we should be doing is saying, no, we believe in certain values that you need to kind of uphold. And I think what that does, it gives us a strength to then say, we will empower voices against it. Otherwise, what we're really doing is we're empowering voices that side with us. And that's perceived as, ironically, we've got agents in colonizing countries, as opposed to saying, no, we want you to have your own empowerment. And the biggest example of that was our failure in Syria. Where we allowed an opposition, which was a natural uprising, to then be suppressed, repressed, where the only people left fighting was the people aligned with Al-Qaeda. And then Bashar would say, look, it's me or Al-Qaeda. And I think this is just some thoughts that I think that kind of sprang up from that.
Thank you. So you yourself a very specialist of Hizb ut-Tahrir, which is a group I don't know very well. I'm French, and this group is not very well represented there. But when I read your writing about this, I noticed that this movement seems to be very close to what I describe in my own book, which is called Le Frérisme en Europe, Brotherism in Europe, just published this year. And for me, this is a synthesis between Muslim Brotherhood and the Jamaat Islami. A synthesis achieved in particular with the help of Said Ramadan in Geneva from the 1960s. Brotherism is a form of intellectual Islamism adapted to secularized, liberal, multicultural, pacified society, which bypasses politics and deploys itself through education, mass culture, or the halal economy. The aim is to drive all the Islamic movements, not to mix them, but to try to guide them, to drive them to the accomplishment of the caliphal prophecy. Hizb ut-Tahrir seems to openly assume the need for a universal caliphate, whereas Brotherism seems to me hiding this agenda. It has not abandoned it, I think, in order to better ally itself with left-wing parties in particular. what are your thoughts about this, and to understand very pragmatically the position of Hizb ut-Tahrir, what are their positions on the mandatory hijab, on the halal way of life, and on the fight against structural Islamophobia, which is the main tool of spreading the ideology of brotherism. What is the position of Hizb ut-Tahrir on this?
So I would start by saying, first of all, when looking at groups like Hizb ut-Tahrir, it's a revolutionary group. When you look at this kind of goal, you have an Islamic state, it implements Islamic laws, which is their interpretation. It creates a constitution, which enforces that over society. This is usually very in conflict with kind of Muslim politics and history, which has had diverse religious interpretations, has different schools of thought. It was a strand of Salafism that wanted to unify it. It was the engagement of modernity, which said that we need to have a modern state with laws and executive. We can't have these multiple judges in different religious communities. It was this idea of a modern state. And so the Islamization of the modern state is what created the Islamic movement and the Islamist movement. Hizb ut-Tahrir is if you like, the more radical end of that spectrum. They're purists, not in the sense of theology, but in the sense of ideology. They will not accept language even like human rights, like democracy. They will say the language itself is antithetical to Islam. Democracy means the rule of man by men. Therefore, the Sharia is the rule of God enforced by men. So de facto authority belongs to men, but de jure sovereignty belongs to God. That's their view of it, and they would reject it absolutely. People like Maududi would say, well, no, we're Democrats because de facto authority belongs to people, so society can govern itself, but we rule by Sharia. And the Brotherhood has a spectrum of views on all of those things. The Hizb has a more purist, if people are familiar with leftist ideology, will find this fairly easy to get. There's a great book that just came out by Masha Karp called Orwell in Russia. It's a brilliant book to read anyway. It's very, very contemporary right now. But also the ideological spectrum of leftist groups at the time is probably a good one to map on many of the Islamist groups. Because you had groups like Hizb ut-Tahrir, the radical revolutionaries. Jamaat-e-Islami started off like that. Then they realized they're not going to attain power in Pakistan. They need to influence the system in Pakistan, the constitution and the laws, so they tried to become a mainstream party. They're seen as a far-right party in a Pakistani context. In Bangladesh, they used to have one MP.
In Europe?
So they are seen as fairly right, very far on the right. Now, their politics and branding in the West was smarter. So they came as mainstream Muslims, they came as, Democrats, as we are alternative, we're the opposition. Especially when you have, in many of these countries, you have repressive regimes or corrupt countries. It's easy to say, look, we're principled, that's why we're persecuted. That doesn't justify the persecution, but actually it's a good way of manipulating a grievance to present themselves. And so groups like Hizb ut-Tahrir, they're on the opposite end of that spectrum. So they, for example, critiqued the idea of Islamophobia. Because, of course you should be afraid of Islam, because Islam has come to take over the world and we're going to do it. They're vanguardists. Vanguardist communists, that you have a party which understands the ideology and leads the masses. That's Hizb ut-Tahrir. They believe they're the vanguard. And that's their kind of point of view. If you read Sayyid Qutb's Milestones, the first chapter, the unique Quranic generation, he's vanguardist like that. The Brotherhood became more pragmatic afterwards, but his strand is vanguardist. Qutbism is vanguardist, and Hizb ut-Tahrir are like that. And then you have the other groups which do hold on to those values, but they recognize you have to be pragmatic, so they talk about gradualism, they talk about pragmatism. Hizb ut-Tahrir says those two ideas are kufr. They're antithetical to Islam. You can't have a bit of Islam, a bit of Sharia, and a bit of democracy, and a bit of secularism. That is and they'll cite passages of the Quran. And they struggle because when people bring to them prophetic precedent for this stuff, that the Prophet didn't impose even prayer on people, they find it very difficult to reconcile. So they will say, that's the Prophet, we can't do that, we have to take the whole ideology. So they will have their own kind of way of dealing with these things. But that's their kind of ideological take. So on things like hijab, so the very funny thing is, because hijab just means a barrier, in the Quranic language, it actually meant for the Prophet's wives to be separate from the believers. So they have a chapter in their book, Social System, which is hijab is not a duty. And it's called al-hijab la yujib al-mar'at al-muslima. It's not, men and women can be in the same space, they can interact, there's no duty. But they say khimar, covering your hair, is a wajib, is a duty. So they get around to that, but they like to be contrarian. They're like Trotskyites. They like to throw these ideas about. So they had this thing of saying, well, hijab is a reactionary religious idea. It's not really part of our ideology. But a woman should be covered, etc. And I think a lot of conservative Muslims across the spectrum would probably agree with them on this. The halal question is interesting because, I usually use this example. If you talk to religious people, you assume they're all anti-abortion, right? I'm not saying that is the case. But this is the assumption in a lot of public discourse, that religious folk are going to stand on one side of abortion, liberals are going to stand on the other side of abortion. Islam, in its theology and jurisprudence, I say this just because the Roe versus Wade thing happened, and I wrote a long piece explaining Islam traditionally has had various views on abortion. The Ottomans were very liberal about abortion. It was only when the Republic came in did they clamp down on it. It was one of those things because it was seen as that was the prevalent trend at the time. And Islam has these very diverse views. And so the problem when you talk about halal, to criticize someone for getting an abortion, for having a child outside of wedlock, for example, whereas classically the Islamic tradition would say it's probably better to do so if you're going to be troubled in society. It's a very antithetical view to prevalent religious assumptions. So when you look at this in this sense, the reification of one view and imposing it by state is what essentially identifies Islamism. That it's not just the idea of you stick to your ethics or your religious views, it's we're going to make this the standard and norm in society, everybody will stick by it, and we're going to enforce it by state law. And this is going to be what is the reified view of what Sharia is. And so they have that as a concept, they have that as a fundamental ideology. And the last thing you mentioned was that hijab,
the Islamophobia.
The Islamophobia, yeah. So they have this kind of contrarian view. Whereas actually they will still, because it's politics, they will still utilize Islamophobia and anti-Muslim sentiment. Because I think it's one thing to say, look, prejudice against Muslims is something we will stand up against. Saying that you have a centralized view of what Islam is and then using it to justify repression on Uyghurs, as the Chinese state has done, using it as the Assad regime has done against all opposition, say, well, you must be Islamist, therefore you're going to be, extremists. Of course, we can stand up to that. But the irony is, we have people who supposedly champion Islamophobia who are big fans of the Chinese regime and the hard leftists. They're big fans of totalitarianism, and they're big fans of that kind of narrative. And so stepping back from it, you find groups like, they will manipulate and use it for their political agenda. It's not a genuine engagement with the idea.
Okay, thank you. Maybe Tommaso, you want to take some question from the...
Yes.
So we have a question from the online audience. So this person would like to know if you are familiar with cases of both individuals, I think, Rashad, it's your own experience as well, individuals and organizations moving from a militant or political form of Islamism towards more moderate positions or even to secularism. And if you think that the migration, acculturation effect can play a role, like people moving from a more Islamic society to a secular society, whether they might change their views about it or whether there are other processes undergoing.
is that directed to anyone?
Well,
I think it's to both. Yeah, the speakers.
You take one question or many questions, or you want to answer? What is the rule?
good question.
Yeah, thanks a lot both for fascinating statements. I have two questions, one for each of you, but I guess they're both actually addressed to both of you maybe. So my first one, mainly to Rashad, but probably also to you, Marwa. So you pointed out the alliance in the anti-Iraq coalition, for instance, with the far left, but I think that problem is far wider. It goes way beyond just the far left, and it goes way beyond just the anti-Iraq coalition. And it made me wonder what the two of you think. How important is the anti-Western sentiment in Islamic religious fundamentalism? Because that is, of course, that's the bridge that is responsible for the alliance with the left. It's the common enemy, basically. It's the common anti-imperialism, the common anti-colonialism, etc. So that frame, is it just sort of strategically used by fundamentalists to make that alliance with the West, or is it something that is genuinely actually very important to understand Islamic fundamentalism? So that's my first question. The second question, mainly to Marwa, but I guess also addressed to you, Rashad, is in response to Florence's question about, so what would be your recommendations for countries of immigration with Muslim minorities? And you said, well, we clearly need rules of how to deal with these Islamist organizations, or strategies on how to deal with them. So what what more concretely would these, say, rules of engagement be? I mean, can go all the way from banning or to do something about foreign funding, or not granting rights. You talked about religious education, I think. What is the rule of engagement then? Not give them the right, or monitor, whatever. What else? Well, it also goes to the question of how to deal with headscarves in public institutions, in the police force, for instance.
We have an hour more. Please.
Okay, take the first question.
Okay, so the first one, I've almost forgotten what it was. There were many groups, individuals that move either way. So to give the example of we had in Egypt, you had the Islamic Jihad movement that went essentially from being a militant movement to being like a Islamist political engagement movement to being a slightly Salafi, quietist / Islamist political engagement movement. So it's kind of de-radicalized itself. And there's a whole set of studies about this. You can read his writing, kind of religious ideological de-radicalization almost. Lifke in Libya did the same thing. Although post-Libyan, post-Arab Spring, it kind of went back into a militant movement because of the environment and the circumstances. I actually think Nahda is a good example of not becoming secular, because they're definitely not secular. Their religious influences are very, very strong, but they started to embrace the notion of democratic change and basic human rights. So there's a few writings, and I think that is because of the pragmatic nature. I think it's also because of the lack of ideological clarity and crystallization. They're not like groups like Hizb ut-Tahrir and Jihadists with very, very fixed ideologies. And thirdly, I think it's what happens when you start to massage your message, you start to believe some of the massaging that you do. So you start saying we're Democrats and you start to embrace some of those kind of ideas. I think some of that, the influence, the environment, the religious internal debates and discussions, did shift them in a tangible way. It's not just surface level. That doesn't mean that they're secular liberals. They're nothing at all as secular liberals. And they may prefer to brand themselves like Christian Democrats or Muslim Democrats. That's the branding exercise. But I think there's a genuine shift. On an individual level, there are hundreds of people that go through this. Yeah. I mean, I've worked with more than 100 individuals that go through the kind of radicalization process. Some of these young people that go off and fight, some of them return back, some of them are imprisoned, some of them are convicted, some of them are released and they're in probation, and you can go through that shift. It's a very complicated, it's a long discussion. I have a paper on it which discusses it briefly, but it's a very long, kind of elaborate discussion. I think it reaches into this point about how do we deal with it. And I think the key point that we're missing in dealing with it is the intellectual side. We're not clearly establishing what values we want to uphold. We're not clearly basing our relationships on the basis of those values. We're not clearly articulating a critique of these ideas as to why we don't hold these ideas. And also, I think sticking to our values is also very, very key. So what does it mean in how we deal with these things? We shouldn't be influenced by prevalent popular discourse that shifts us away from our value system. We should be able to go to our value system and determine what the right course of action is, but by being ideologically aware, not being ideologically ignorant. And I think part of the problem is, what you have had is groups like Roundtree, as an example, a wonderful charity that funded groups like Cage. We had Amnesty International, again, a charity that's based upon prisoners of conscience and human rights, end up aligning itself with radical jihadi groups and defending people who are... And it's not to say that we believe these people shouldn't have their rights. We should just be very, very clear. Of course they should have their rights, but those rights don't mean that we align ourselves with a reactionary, regressive ideological persuasion. So I think some of that is really, really key. And at the same time, when looking at questions as we would do, address the issue for what it is, not in a context that is ideological. I think that's quite key. Be aware of it, so don't be ill-informed of it, which I think is part of the problem, but at the same time, don't allow it to shape your parameters of action. I hope that starts to look at some of these.
Thank you, Maho.
Okay. With regard to the strategies, more concretely, I think a starting point would be the mapping of these organizations and their funding streams and their activities. And I think Germany has already done that, and also Sweden, Austria, and Netherlands. They have done something in the last 5 years, but then nothing more has been done. So probably it would be a good idea to revisit or review these assessments and perhaps assign priorities to those organizations that perhaps they need to be looked more into their activities and funding streams. Now, I think the West or Europe is, you have a normative framework where you uphold the values of democracy and human rights. So anything you do, any strategy you have, must comply with human rights and fundamental freedoms. And those also has to be afforded to these groups as well. So whatever strategy implemented would have to take into account that aspect, but also the security aspects and the ideological aspect of what they are trying to do and achieve in Europe. So that's one thing. The other thing is, when I said regulation of the educational services, and well, I know that some of these organizations, for instance, they receive funding from the states, from the governments, and the least that could be done is an evaluation and an impact assessment of what they have done with the money that they received from the states. That's part of accountability. You take money from the government, you need to show that you've done the work that you said that you would do, and there are no unintended or intended negative impact on the societies. What should be done with regard to headscarves in public institutions and things and behaviors or notions that are not in line with the value system that Europe has? Well, actually, I would go back to what Rashad said about the importance of being courageous to discuss those issues. I mean, I see, and to be very honest, because also I work on counter-violence extremism and radicalization and all these things, and there is some fear to touch on ideologies, especially when it comes to Islam, because everyone is afraid to be labeled as Islamophobes. And let's be honest, it's very easy to be labeled Islamophobe. in Europe. But I believe that the discussion, we need to have those conversations about what are our values and how can we ensure that those values are kept and upheld and those freedoms are not used in a manner that would be in conflict with our value system.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, just on that as well, I think there is a tension. And that tension, I think, comes in, I think it's Article 18 of the European Human Rights Act, is you can't use human rights to suppress human rights, is one of the kind of criteria.
Yes.
And I can see why that causes a tension, because especially in a German context, you have a constitutional ministry. There's a history of preserving the constitution from ideologues that want to suppress it. And so I can understand it's a very different context to, say, Britain. You know, it'd be very, very far-fetched in the UK to even consider proscription of many of these groups and organizations, because our legal culture and traditions just wouldn't do that. And I can see that's different in the German context, where you would consider an anti-Semitic organization to be very, very clearly against the law, and you'd be able to clamp down on it and forbid it and prescribe it. We don't have that in the UK, frankly. So there are very different histories and legal trajectories. And I think some of that does create this tension. At the same time, we spent a lot of time not banning extremist terrorist organizations in the UK. Al-Muhajirun were operating freely for a very, very long time. I still don't know if there was some strategy to this, if there was an intelligence gathering operation, if there was an investigative strategy to say maybe we shouldn't do it. But really undermine the idea of the rule of law to say we have legislation that bans such and such organizations that were just never applied. So I think some of those things, you know, if you go to Muslim communities, they will turn around and say, why are you banning them? Because they're naturally slightly more on the right than this generation of young people, and they find it very, very strange as an action. And I think I'm quite sympathetic to that emotion.
Okay, we have one question there.
Okay, fascinating talks. I want to switch to a different perspective. I mean, maybe the only time when secularism was at issue, Kemal and the army have been the decisive forces. So my question is, do you see the army in relation to these Islamic forces to play an own role, to be propelled by the modernization that comes with being or having a good army, navy, and air force? Is that do you find forces there that would try to change, maybe not to a democracy, but to solve the fundamental problem of securing a secular space, to disentangle religion and the state? I mean, this is at the heart of it. And I wonder that studies on the defense and armies that have been prevalent when it came to Algeria, etc., to the French movement, there the armies took an active role. So let me close that.
Maybe.
How about the army and secularization?
Marwa?
Well, that's a very context-specific. It's a very broad question, and the answer would really be different according to each of the contexts. Let me talk about Egypt. So Egypt and the army. I mean, the army's role was not really protecting the state or separating the religion from the state or any of that. but the relationship between the people in Egypt and the army is quite different than in many other countries. So when there is a problem, they look at the army because it's the trusted actor that can be brought in and resolve and solve the problem. Now, in the Egyptian case, the Muslim Brotherhood, in 1 year or 2 years, they have failed drastically in terms of governance. Egyptians see the military as an actor that has a command chain and they can govern. So they turned to the army to play this role. In other countries, again, it's very different and depends on the relationship between the people and the army. So you might take that.
Yeah, I mean, I can. You mentioned Kemal, and you're talking in a Turkish context.
Yeah.
I think, look, there's a lot of mythology around this. Look at Mustafa Kemal's early kind of aspirations. He was an aspirant to being the imam. He was an aspirant to being the religious and political leader. This kind of mythology surrounding his secularization is a mythology that happened post-Republic. So it's a complete kind of re-description of history. It's something to really look into. With the Turkish example, I think as well, societies don't change by force. It just doesn't happen, which is why Turkey is divided as a society between very, very religious and very, very liberal secular. And so that was manifest in the recent election, with the complete polarization. So militaries don't create social change within society. The Egyptian example is very, very specific.
Exactly.
And I think it's specific because you had a mass popular dissentiment as well as turning to the militaries. The military that governed the revolutionary changes, the Brotherhood made an alliance with to come to power in the first place. The Brotherhood Morsi thought he had support from the military to stay in power. It's the same mistake they made the first time round with the Gamal Abdel Nasser.
Yeah.
And so when looking at, and I think the Algerian context is very telling.
Yeah.
Algeria had the mass suppression, murder of just people because they failed to, they saw what FIS was going to come into power in the election that sprung and created the jihad movement in Algeria that spread across through networks into France. It's actually, I would say, it's a categorical no. It doesn't engineer social change. To engineer social change, you need social actors to do so, and it's intellectual political change. So I think it's actually the opposite. I think any time the military has stepped in, it's never led to the most positive consequences. Turkey is actually a good example of that. The coups that came in that were supported tacitly by Western powers to stop people like Erbakan coming in initially didn't stop Erdogan coming in. Mm-hmm. And when Erdogan came in, his removal of rights from democratic institutions now is what we're seeing.
What was it your question?
I have a question to you. I mean, when I mentioned Algeria, the case of Algeria, what I had in mind was that the army at that time, for people who had no money, was an educational institution. And many Algerians who couldn't afford to go to the university or whatnot, they learned in the army. And what they also learned was that it was not God who were making victory or loss in a battle. They learned how to calculate, how to shoot. That is, they had a different mindset. I mean, that was what I meant with the army. If you are a good army commander, you have to have a different mindset as an imam. I mean, that's for sure. And that was the background of my question.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
I'm not sure if that is the case. When you look at Islamists, they're very strategic. Mm-hmm. They don't believe that God is going to deliver them to power. They believe in tactics and strategy, influence and politics. Mm-hmm. So the issue there isn't this kind of religious sentimentality versus strategic engagement. I think that's another misnomer. I think actually the Islamists are far more tactical and strategic than their opposition groups in my opinion. This is why, if you look at Erdogan as an example, his first case in power was very, very effective. He ran a strong economy. He was able to curb the influence of the military. And then when he had his opportunity, he shut down civil society organizations, controlled the media, and stopped effective opposition within those societies to be able to publicly challenge him. That doesn't mean that it's completely autocratic, but he's doing his best to make it that way.
So we have a question from Lian Duffy, who requested to be identified by name because he's your friend and he wants to be a bit provocative, he said. So basically his argument is we can criticize Hizb ut-Tahrir because they are explicit in what they want. But how can civil society and commentators criticize groups that either obscure their true nature or even worse, respond with lawfare tactics and with accusation of Islamophobia? And then I take the liberty to be a bit provocative with Marwa instead. So there is a recent book called Recasting Islamic Law, where the author, Rachel Scott, basically wonders what is the reason why the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt was criticized due to its Islamism, given the fact that, as you confirmed beforehand, sometimes the Egyptian society or the societies of other Muslim countries are themselves imbued with the same ideology. And I want to make the example of Al-Azhar. Al-Azhar is an institution that has been at the forefront of all takfiri tactics aimed at silencing, putting in prison, sometimes killing free thinkers and apostates. So how can a campaign aimed at promoting moderation in society be entrusted to an organization, an institution such as Al-Azhar, and how can we hope that these will bear fruits? In what are they different from having the Muslim Brotherhood in power? Thank you.
Well, one word, the political will. Okay, so Al-Azhar, I agree with you that that happened. And Al-Azhar has been infiltrated as well by Islamists and Salafis who have been very resistant to change. But in the last few years, the president basically called upon Al-Azhar to start reforming the political discourse and to start providing some progressive interpretation of Islam that would counter not only the Muslim Brotherhood or the Islamist narratives, but also the extremist groups like ISIS and the like. Now, the head of the Al-Azhar institution wanted to do so, but you have all the internal forces within Al-Azhar that have alliances with those Islamist groups stopping it and pushing back on it. I'm not trying to make excuses, but that's the reality. And not only the internal forces in Al-Azhar, but even when... So in Egypt, we had a very big problem with the FGM, female genital mutilation. And the women movement managed to work with the parliament and the politicians to actually enact a law that would incriminate this act and punish the perpetrators and the parents if they expose their daughters to circumcision. Now, not only this, but also Al-Azhar has issued a fatwa or a religious opinion that would actually support the law and saying that this is haram. This is a revolutionary fatwa because no one thought that this actually would happen. FGM has been part of this religious and social tradition in Egyptian society that you could not even discuss, let alone say, well, it's wrong and you shouldn't do it and you will go to jail. The pushback on this was not from the institution itself, because there was also a political will for this fatwa to be issued, but the pushback came from the Salafis and from the Muslim Brotherhood. And now we've got the social media, which amplifies these voices. So we also have the normal ordinary citizens who are conservatives and who have been living in society, being exposed to those Islamist ideologies. And these notions have become an integral part of their belief system. So we've got all of these elements that would slow down institutions like Al-Azhar from actually doing the religious discourse that they are supposed to do. So it needs internal reform for sure, but also there needs to be a lot of work done with the people in the communities and with the way the religion is being taught, and trying to separate the norm, the social norm, from religious rules. And this is not happening at the moment. Standardizing sermons every Friday does not really achieve this result. And to an extent, we are quite timid until now to touch those notions and to talk frankly about what are the wrong or old interpretations of Islam, and that there is a need for a more progressive views on those issues.
I mean, can I just comment on this as someone who's been at Al-Azhar as well, that what you'll find is an exposure to a diverse set of views. So I remember listening to a chap coming in saying that stoning women to death is not a part of Islam, or stoning men to death for that matter for adultery. And he gave a lecture and he said this is not really part of the Sharia, etc. We also had another chap who came in, I'm not going to mention names, but he came in and he said, somebody asked him the question about someone who feels they need to have a sex change, and he was very much, you take them out and beat them. So you have this kind of like, this tension is that you do have different personalities of different people. And the strength of Al-Azhar was actually that diversity. Obviously diversity in itself, for its sake, is not a good thing if what you're presenting is something really, really horrid as well. So actually I can understand the institutional challenges. But this actually comes down to understanding Islam and Christianity and these religions, they're not the same. You don't reform Islam by changing the institutions, because the institutions don't have that kind of shape and structure that Christianity did. That you change the top, it filters down to the bottom, you've changed the religious views and attitudes. That just isn't how Islam has centers of learning, institutions, and actually is going to be a cultural intellectual change. And on that note, I think historically Al-Azhar, for example, the former head, Sheikh Mahmoud Shaltut, was around, who spoke very, very strongly against things like killing people for apostasy, notions of executing people by making takfir of them, and so on. And he wrote about this in his work Islam and Sharia, Aqidah wa Sharia, Islam, Aqidah wa Sharia, and in his fatwa. And so actually, as an institution, it's had scholarship is challenging. I'm not trying to defend it all. It's actually just the nature of intellectual institutions like that. They are going to be diverse. They're going to, and you can't control them. No. And you can't, by state, create a new version of Islam. I think that's the problem. As soon as you get state interference, it's going to lack an element of legitimacy, because it's going to be seen as state interference. And actually, Ahmed Tayyib tried to push back on Sisi suggesting that you're going to do this. He almost tried to say, well, we do this ourselves. We have our own ideas. We have a tradition of looking at religious interpretation. And it is that tension that's there. And this actually brings to the point that Liam mentioned, because intellectual change is a difficult issue to kind of look at. So with groups like Hizb ut-Tahrir, yes, they're very obvious, yes, they're very easy. With people, we think they're really smart and you can't really catch them out. But actually, if, for example, Sufyan Ismail, who was caught saying he funded Cage, and if, on the other hand, he celebrated the defeat of the 300-year-old Zionist lobby, i.e. Jews, because there hasn't been a Zionist lobby for 300 years in Britain, is very, very clear. He's an anti-Semitic conspiracist. He supports groups like Cage. And then when he says, well, I'm a Democrat and I also fund MEND, it's very, very clear. This is who he is. He's told you who he is. Believe him. He's spreading his kind of conspiracism, his support for these extremists. It's not a conspiracy to highlight that. It is just factual reporting. And I think there needs to be support for good investigative factual reporting to demonstrate that kind of stuff. So I would push back a little bit on what Liam has said. especially as he can't reply, so he's got no way of defending himself. You can actually do this well. It's just that we have not had the brave journalists and intellectuals always to do that. It is a sad situation where if you do so, you live with the consequences. And many of us in the UK have lived with those consequences, which is a report that Liam actually wrote about people who suffered consequences as a result of standing up against extremism.
One more question?
Yeah.
Yeah. It would be the last.
Yeah, thank you. I have a question. It was so interesting to listen to you, but I did not hear anything about the demographic problem of the Islamic world, of the Islam world. If you see that the highest birth rates are Afghanistan, Iraq, they have a great youth bulge problem. And I ask myself, I don't hear anything about idea in the Islamic world how to reduce this problem, because it's a huge problem. I don't know whether you heard of the war index of Professor Gunnar Heinzen, which analyzes this very well. And why does the Islamic world not intervene against these high birth rates that don't correspond with the rate of the economic growth, and therefore only creates poverty? And poverty makes the big problems. So the demography is stronger than any question of religion or democracy. It's the need of the people. Or does the Islamic world not give an answer? Because I'm sorry now, but you know, I live in Berlin. The most popular name of pupil in Berlin in the schools is Mohammed, not Karl-Heinz or Willi, Maria, you know. And if you see that Saudi Arabia pays money to the Muslims who get children in Cordoba, in Granada, in Al-Andalus, is it a policy to reconquer Europe? I ask this without any evaluation. It's just a question to reconquer Europe.
Okay, it's a frank question.
Yeah, frank question. Let's just go through this very quickly. We didn't touch on millions of things because we spoke about a very specific issue. There are tons of problems in Muslim majority countries and outside of them that we could probably speak about all day. The demographic issue, look at urbanization. When you have urbanization, industrialization, you have a natural fall in child birth rates. This is quite a natural phenomena. You see this whenever you have big industries and big cities happen. In societies where that doesn't happen, you have larger birth rates. This is just how it is. In terms of actually dealing with that, actually Bangladesh, as an example, has managed to get both religious and non-religious people in to talk about family planning, and it's quite a strong part of its growth. It's actually a massive country. It has more than 100 million people within it, and it's one of the things that they've looked at. And also, it isn't really the key cause of all the economic problems. That's more to do with mal-administered economies, where, for example, a military in a particular country may control most of the industry. It's countries like Saudi Arabia, where actually it's the royal family which has a massive, disparate usage of resources in the country in a horrendously terrible way. And that, to the core of the question, Saudi Arabia has no intent of doing anything of recapturing Europe. It's more intent on controlling its own population, becoming more internally more totalitarian, which is what the direction of travel is with MBS. But again, all of those issues, it's not to say none of them are not points of discussion, but they're probably not, I don't perceive them in the same way as maybe you see them.
The second part of the question, it is finished. The second part of the question is about immigration. I missed that. Is there a migration issue? I think this is a really, there are real questions about immigration, and there are real questions about how we determine policy towards it. And I think there's also real questions about how you stop immigration. And the way you don't stop immigration is by empowering a dictator that suppresses his people, creates a fascist narrative about Africans, as an example, as in Tunisia, which causes more and spurs more immigration out, or by empowering a dictator which has slaughtered more than 1 million of its population in Syria, as an example, leading to 10 million people being dispersed outside Syria.
and in Syria. So you've had mass migration as a result of a war launched on its population, which we've stood by and done nothing about. So I think there's lots of other bigger questions about how to manage these things. And there's lots of other policy-related issues related to how we deal with and differentiate between refugees, asylum seekers, economic migrants, industrial migrants, migration when we need it, and migration when we don't. They're all very difficult, different questions, and they need a consistent level of policy. I come from a country which is run like a basket case at the moment with these issues, and they're running it terribly on the kind of migration, asylum, and immigrants. They're all looked at in one big pot, and they're different questions that require different lenses of analysis.
It was not really the topic of today, but I'm sure that the Center will probably address this topic in the future. Thank you very much for... Thank you.